You will see. I don't know.
We will record it. And we'll start because we need to, as I told you, I'm so sorry. I have only the free version of Zoom for the time being. So we will have 30 minutes and then a break and then another 30 minutes. And then if we need more for the Q&A also, we will have more time. So we'll start our lecture guest series today. Our guest is Professor Arun, who is a full professor of structural engineering at IIT Madras. He holds a first degree in architecture and a PhD in earthquake engineering from the University of Pavia, Italy. His research interests are in structural aspects of historical constructions, earthquake behavior of historical masonry structures, earthquake-resistant structural masonry, and earthquake risk assessment. He currently coordinates the activities of National Center for Safety of Heritage Structures, a Ministry of Education supported research center at IIT Madras. He was an expert member in the International Coordinating Committee for the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bagan, Myanmar, and currently is a member expert advisory group to the International Conservation Committee for Wat Phu, UNESCO World Heritage Site in Laos. He is an expert member of the Scientific Committee for Earth and Architecture. He has been involved in conservation projects in India, different areas in India with different examples, in Myanmar as well, in World Heritage Sites there, and in the Philippines. So without further ado, Prof. Arun, the screen and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Professor Naima. I'm very happy to be with your students who are following the course on conservation. And of course, it would be great to meet in person, but we are, leveraging this new dimension post-pandemic, which I think is very useful in all fields of education. Especially the education world has risen up to this interesting way of learning without boundaries, and so that's fantastic. And I'm very happy to be in your midst. So the presentation, the topic of the presentation that I've chosen has got to do with structural conservation works. But I would like to focus specifically on challenges that we face very often in living temples, and a country like India, and not limited to India, but a lot of parts of the world, you have living religious sites. And these living religious sites, which when are particularly places of archaeological importance, start becoming rather complex in terms of how one can do conservation in these spaces. And that's the crux of the presentation. Let me move on and give you an idea of the lecture. It's organized in this manner. I would like to give you first a context of the living temples of South India, and my focus is particularly on one state in India, and that's called Tamil Nadu, which is this on the southeast part of peninsular India. And based on this context, I would like to examine three cases. One, which is a temple that was damaged in a fire in 2018 and had to go through a phase of assessment before the restoration strategy could be chalked out. The second is a pilot project which was taken up a few years ago for restoration as a demonstrative example in the context of the living temples of Tamil Nadu. And the third one is another interesting case study, which is based on the compulsions of living heritage, living religious heritage. So I intend to look at three different situations. One is sort of a post-disaster situation. The second is a standard restoration project of a very valuable temple. And the third is really a unique sort of a situation where a work that is incomplete in history is looked upon to be completed for worship today. So these are the three cases that I'm looking at. And in that context, I'm just trying to move this ribbon here. I think there's a hide ribbon option. Yeah, that's okay. So in the context of such historical sites, particularly historical religious sites, it's useful to understand what is the heritage value. And as I said, in different cultures, in different regions of the world, you will find parallels. So in this context, the heritage value really refers to it's sort of a balance between the historical and archaeological aspects, the architectural details, the architectural significance, the artistic and the cultural practices. In many cases, there's also literary considerations because there is important historic literature that is based on such sites. These are associated to the tangible values, the tangible elements of the heritage value. You can have these related to the immovable parts of the heritage, the structure, but you could also have movable parts of the structure where you would have vehicles which are used for religious processions. And then there are aspects such as the sculptures in the temple, the paintings, there are inscriptions and so on. So these would form really the tangible elements of the heritage value. You also have an important aspect in such living temples, which are the intangible elements. And here, in the context of the temples that we are referring to, it's the traditional knowledge systems. These traditional knowledge systems of how these temple rituals are to be performed, how these temples are to be constructed, how idols have to be made, and so on. So along with that, you also have aspects such as the beliefs, which are also reflected in the performing arts. So it's a combination of tangible and intangible elements that really comprise the heritage value of such precincts and need to be preserved in such context. So the focus cannot be only on the intangible. The focus cannot be only on the tangible. One needs to really strike a balance and ensure that both these are addressed as well as possible. So moving on, let me give you the basic context of the living temples of South India. And South India has one of the largest stock of temples and also the living temples which are in function for several hundreds of years. So what is important to see is the sort of governmental framework that is there in order to administer the function of these temples, and also to really look at how aspects such as conservation can come into these temples. So the state of Tamil Nadu, which is in the southeastern part of India, has about 40,000 temples. And of these 40,000 temples, almost 9,000 of them are actually more than 100 years old. And 100 is sort of a questionable number, but we're talking of at least 100 years. These are sites where historic records talk of the temple location being there for more than 2,000 years in some cases. So it's 100 to several hundreds of years and even thousands of years. So that's the kind of stock that we are looking at. And so in the during the British period, India was under the British rule. There was an attempt to sort of identify the lands belonging to these temples and then bring it under a government structure And therefore, in the early 1900s, a body referred to as the Hindu Religious Endowments Board was actually instituted. Post-independence, this was then, there was an act that was passed in the legislative assemblies, and the act is referred to as the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act of 1951, and there are amendments thereof. This act really takes care of the administration of the temples that are under the government. As once this act was in place, the government thought it was important to have a separate government department that takes care of temples. And it's not only the physical assets that need to be protected, but also there is revenue generation. There is devotees give money to the temple. So there is a financial aspect that needs to be taken care of. And then there's a large body of persons working in these temples. And so an entire structure needs to be present. And that's what this department actually takes care of. So within the regulatory framework that this body has for the temples, there are rules framed under this act, and the rules, particularly dealing with the civil works, talk of civil works within temple complexes so that they cater to the public, to the pilgrims, the devotees, but is very careful in saying that the historical parts of the temple, which are typically constructed in historic bricks or in stone and have lime stucco work on it, is to be excluded from what is referred to as civil work, because that needs special expertise in order to be preserved and in order to be repaired and so on. So the rules very clearly say that if you're talking of civil work, understand that we are not talking of the historical parts of the precinct, but it's really the amenities that we are talking about. And then it says, well, then what do we do about all these historical parts of the site? And there are multiple, and I'll talk about a few of them in the next few slides. There are multiple parts of the historical elements of a temple. It requires that traditional craftsmen, traditional builders, they are referred to as stapatis, and I will come back and use this word multiple times. It's almost a parallel profession. Today we have architects and civil engineers, but then in the ancient times you only have stapatis who were builders and master builders, and they could come and choose a site and design the structure, construct the structure, and hand it back to the pilgrims, to the devotees to run the temple. So even today, it is very clear that when you're constructing structures within a temple and which are not the regular civil structures, you need a stapati to be involved in carrying out this work, and that person has to be approved, enlisted in the government after his credentials are verified. And it also says, yes, the rules say that you can have historical temples in this context, and therefore, whenever there is a renovation or repair required in any of these temples, you need to bring in an archaeological perspective, and therefore the involvement of the archaeologists through the Archaeological Survey of India is mandated. So that's an interesting aspect that was written down in the Act, which says civil work is different from the kind of work in these religious structures. One, you need to entrust this work to traditional craftsmen and masons, temple builders, and if they are traditional constructions and they are ancient constructions, you need to bring in archaeologists. So it's, the Act is very unambiguous on what should be the direction that we have to adopt. So, well, we're talking of 1959, and then about 60 years have passed between when this Act was passed and the condition today. And there have been challenges in being able to protect such a large number of historical temples and have sufficient skill sets in the country to be able to take care of such a large number of in the region, to be able to take care carefully of such a large number of historical monuments. And the challenge has also been, it is a site which is of religious importance, and hence the public participation in these sites is very large. And so one has to cater to the amenities required for the devotees. Whereas on the other hand, this is also these are also locations of archaeological and historical importance. So striking this balance has been 7 decades. And it is after a lot of deliberation that the recent note of a policy note of the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments actually recognizes that there isn't a detailed conservation manual that really helps in the conservation, renovation, and restoration works that have to be carried out in these temples, with ensuring that the heritage value of these temples is not altered. And why so? I think that is where I'm getting to. The policy note had to explicitly state that we have to be careful in all the works that we are carrying out in these temples, because it can end up damaging the heritage value of such temples. And the policy note again reiterates that it is important to consult experts. And these experts are people who are working in heritage conservation, restoration, and archaeology. And scientific methods have to be adopted for carrying out any interventions. And in order to put in place checks and balances, several mechanisms were introduced. And so there were state level committees and smaller regional committees that were instituted to sort of screen the proposals being taken up at each temple before they are even executed. So since people realized that the work being executed under this department was really not meeting the necessary objectives, they decided to have screening committees that actually look at a multidisciplinary screening committee that starts looking at what is the nature of work and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I've highlighted the work in the word Tirupani in red, and the reason is that is the name given to the work carried out in these temples. The rest of the work would be civil works, whereas the work related to the historical structures and the gods' structure, that is the religious structures, directly the abode of the god, is referred to as Tirupani, meaning God's work. So it is classified and differentiated from the civil work that is meant for the devotees and the pilgrims coming to the temple. And therefore, the department actually has instituted an expert committee that goes into the proposals for each of these temples. And mind you, when I'm saying 9,000 temples, you can imagine the scale of the work that is required to be able to screen all this. So every temple that is more than 100 years old actually has to goes through this mechanism of screening before anything is approved. That's just to give you a breakup. So there are about 44,301 temples, and there are subcategories within that. And as I said, about 9,000 of them are historical temples. So this is really the context. And as I said, since 1950s onwards, such work have been carried out by the department. However, there's also been a lot of criticism over time of the type of work carried out in these temples. So if you really look at the composition of the department has an engineering and renovation wing, also referred to as the Tirupani wing, which I had mentioned earlier. This is the one that really does the renovation and conservation of the historical portions of these temples as well. So basically, you have engineers, you have drafting officers who are doing drafting, and they are in charge of, they are really in charge of scrutinizing the estimates. They look at all the list of works that are to be carried out. They approve the estimates, and then finally, they also supervise the works and periodically check what is happening. Currently, this wing has about 226 people working for this entire state, which is really a small number of people considering the number of structures that are there. And you can see the breakup, the structure in terms of you have a chief engineer, you have superintending engineer, you have executive engineers, assistant executive engineers who are civil, you have engineers who are electrical engineers, and then so that's the entire structure of the people. And you can see that it's predominantly engineers. And what really happens is you have a parallel cadre. You have a cadre of these sthapatis who are, recognized for their training in the traditional temple building activity. And as you can see, there are about 39 plus 21, about 60 60 such sthapatis who are serving the entire state. So that's the overall structure. And what really happens is this department does not have engineers that they recruit themselves. Since it's a small number of engineer positions, they do not have the legal possibility of directly recruiting as permanent positions engineers in their engineers from outside. So they cannot, while they can actually select these sthapatis themselves, they cannot select engineers themselves. They'll have to depend on other departments in deputing engineers to the charitable end, or to this particular department. And you can see where the problem is. You can see that there are about 226 engineers versus about 60 people who really know the way these structures have to be worked with, materials have to be worked with. The rest of the engineers are coming with training in civil and electrical engineering as the modern engineering and architecture education actually trains them. And they come with knowledge of reinforced concrete, steel, and knowledge of codes, which, as you know, cannot be applied at all in most of these cases. So that's really the issue, where the supervisory work, the approval work is all being carried out by engineers, whereas the sthapatis are essential for actual execution. And the engineers who come on deputation from two departments traditionally. And the two departments are the Public Works Department, and which basically looks at all civic structures, and the Highways Department, which is looking at roads and bridges. So the kind of training, the kind of background that these engineers receive is very clearly in estimation of quantities, preparing cost estimates, doing work measurements, and all those, but not really customized, not really trained in the traditional construction practices and the importance of heritage value of some of all these types of constructions. This has really been the big challenge. And since they come on deputation, they come for a period of about 3 years. And after 3 years, they move back to their parent department, which means if an engineer is brought into this department and is trained for about 2 or 3 years, by the time he or she really starts working productively within this sort of a context, goes back to the parent department, and then you still have the next season a new crop of engineers who come in without any background in terms of what needs to be done in these constructions. So with the net result that over the last 60 years, there have been several examples of inappropriate and unregulated civil works that are carried out in these historical temples. I'll give you a glimpse of a few of these, which are really the sore points of lots of people who care about these temples and study these temples. Sandblasting, for example, is used to clean granite. It is actually not permitted to use sandblasting as per archaeological principles, and there are government orders that prohibit the use of sandblasting. But then sandblasting is easy technique to remove the surface paints or surface patina, and they end up removing even bas relief and inscription. So this is one example. Another example is in stone masonry, pointing the stone masonry, the pointing of stone masonry being carried out with cement mortar, because it is easier to work with cement mortars, and these engineers who come in are really conversant with cement and concrete and so on. And they realize it's harder to work with lime, it's time consuming, it's difficult to procure, and therefore cement mortar is used for renovation works. And so you can see pointing with stone masonry, but then the damage, as you know, as persons working in this field, it's a long-lasting damage that you do to stone in this context. Other things, you need public amenities. So water tanks might have to be installed. Unfortunately, some of these water tanks are installed in locations where they should not be installed. They obscure the architectural quality of the space. They load locations which should not be loaded. There is a tendency to use bright colors in these temples, and they end up using enamel paints on historic stone surfaces, and this sort of obscure the historic stone surfaces with painting. Then there are lots of elements that are building elements that are not compatible with historical, the vocabulary of materials used in these temples. For example, PVC, polyvinyl chloride, PVC sheets are used as skylights, and this is again one example. What you can see is the roof of a temple, and it's sort of obscured by this construction. Painting, the whole concept of renovation and making it look bright and new ends up removing historical layers of paint and bringing in very bright colors which are not present in the historic palette of colors, and end up making the space quite dramatic in terms of not being a historic precinct, but making it look jarry, really. Also, since there are no mechanisms, there were no mechanisms of bringing in bringing in experts who know how to work with mural paintings. They don't have mechanisms to ensure that this can be tendered out to people who have the background in how ancient paintings should be cleaned. They end up giving it to contractors who have no idea of how such paintings must be preserved. And there are several instances of such paintings being even defaced because of ignorance of how to deal with such paintings. And that is really the reason that over 60 years, immense losses have been seen, and is the reason why the temple is the reason why the temple department realized things are not going as planned. So with this situation in mind, what really happened was in 2015, the courts took cognizance of the situation, and they said, unless we intervene in a very serious manner, it's going to be problematic. And so here, what actually happened is there was a public interest litigation. The public can actually file a litigation against the government department in the court and said, look, we are losing these historical places and something needs to be done. So in 2015, there was a writ petition in the Madras High Court, which is Madras is present-day Chennai. Madras High Court is the court of jurisdiction in the state of Tamil Nadu. And the court said, yes, we take cognizance of what is happening. It just issued an interim judgment asking all renovation works in all the 40,000 temples to be just stopped, and said, we really need to examine what is happening and take a relook at the mechanisms and come back with prescriptions. And in the meantime, the temple department was also blocked because of this. They said, so there is important work that needs to happen in multiple temples, and you can't just block the whole thing. And therefore, what the court did was, the court said, okay, before we come up with the final judgment, in the ensuing period, let us have an interim committee of people who know the subject, and let us take every proposal through this committee and approve only works that are of emergency nature or urgent nature, and wait for the completion of the proceedings of the case and come up with the final verdict before allowing all works in the temple. So this was a very interesting phase. It actually went on for about 6 years. And a group of experts were assembled by the court. It involved the sthapatis that I'm talking about. It involved the traditional builders. It involved scholars who are aware of the way in which temples have to be built, the way in which temple rituals have to be conducted. They involved an archaeologist, a conservation expert, an engineer, a structural engineer, and the administrators of the department. So you can actually see 6 different expertises have been brought together to collectively take a decision on how conservation work should happen in these historical temples, which was a very lofty goal, but was very interesting to see how it proceeded. In fact, the court was so upset with the whole thing that they actually asked UNESCO to have a fact-finding mission and a series of volumes on the issues in these temples were also identified through UNESCO India office. And finally, as I said, 6 years later, there was a landmark verdict, and the landmark verdict actually allowed the temple department to proceed with the works, but with very strict instructions. And in fact, the court came up with about 75 different suggestions that the department must take care of. In fact, some of the things are, there was a heritage commission that was formed consisting of about 17 members that will identify structures, monuments, temples, all the antiquities of archaeological and historical importance within the state. At the state level, there will be an expert committee that will accord sanctions for repairs and renovations in these temples. The state level committee will get feedback from a district level committee, which is below the state level committee. And then the department was asked to prepare a conservation manual so that engineers, architects, and archaeologists and all the people involved can actually follow such a conservation manual strictly. And they also said you must now strengthen the infrastructure of the department so that there is in-house capacity building to be able to take on such a large volume of work. So with that little background, I would like to discuss some of the basic aspects as I step into the three examples. Would you like me to stop here? We have about 4.5 minutes, so I can get started and then stop as the time runs out.
Maybe since we are going to another point, we will stop here and then we will come back.
Okay, sure, sure. If there are any questions, I could take them.
Yes, we could do that. 2 or 3.
Or anything. It's completely up to you.